trust needs to be established.
Security is a shared responsibility.
Confidentiality, integrity, availability, authentication, authorization, non-repudiation.
So that probably gives you a sort of unique perspective.
Always try to test against those things to make sure that they cannot happen. So we are actually trying to effectively break the system in every possible way.
Hi, Craig Wilson here, back again with another episode of Making the Media. Hope you're enjoying the season so far. This time, security is the topic up for discussion. It's a really crucial element of any broadcast organization these days. I always remember a few years ago a customer describing themselves as an enormous bullseye target for hackers and bad actors, and the strenuous and ongoing efforts of their information security team to maintain their defenses. Well, the threat since then has only continued to evolve, and security remains a major topic of discussion within the industry. So what's Avid doing about security? Well, let's find out from a key player for us, Ilia Murjev. He is a consulting product designer here at Avid, working on security across the product portfolio, but most notably these days on Avid Content Core. And he began by outlining his role in the organization.
In my role, I'm at the intersection between the product and the engineering. I'm defining the security requirements that get implemented into the product from the beginning, which means that this is something that is defined not as an afterthought, but as a design principle into our products and everything that we implement. And that is in short what is my role in Avid. I come from a previously also somehow long experience in different security implementations for B2B integrations. So this is a continuation of what I do.
So before we move in to talk about some of the specifics of what we do in terms of the products and things like that, just talk a little bit about Avid's overall approach to security in its products. You mentioned there that you sort of sit between the product and engineering teams, so that probably gives you a sort of unique perspective into what's done across the board.
Yeah, right. We have a structured approach to security, as it should be, right? We are approaching it in a structured way. It means that we start from an established secure software design tenets. There are several principles that we always align to and use as a guiding principle, and what we design and implement always is related to that. Those are things like confidentiality, integrity, availability, authentication, authorization, non-repudiation, meaning that you always have to make sure that someone who did something could not deny doing it, and those are always used, and we're using it in terms of the framework that they are codified, industry-wide into something that is, the secure software lifecycle principles, and we're using this framework when we are measuring how we progress, when we're measuring how mature is the security of our products and implementation. So we are deeply within that, and in terms of the operation, beside the principles, we're operating using two main principles in designing our secure software requirements. The first is the zero trust principle, which basically means that there is no request or entity which has default trust. Always all the exchanges, all the interactions, and everything that is happening between different parts of the product and the platform is always authenticated, and trust needs to be established. It's not implicit. And the other is the defense in depth, which basically means that in all the security controls that we put in place, being for authentication, authorization, access control, or data protection, there is no a single control which is the last defense. They're always stuck in a way that there is always a case if there is a compromise, they should be always localized. There is nowhere the case when a compromise in one of those things would just basically open more, just exacerbate the problem. And
So
the other thing is just one more thing is the threat modeling. We also doing threat modeling when we're designing. This is also very important, and it is really grounded in a real life evaluation of what is the attack surface, what is the vector, and what's the adversary analysis. So we're applying this on the data movement diagram into the end-to-end flow of what we're doing, into the business flow of what we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a subject I think now that always comes up in conversations with customers. And is it the case that there's like industry best practices or standards that we're trying to adhere to as well? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, indeed. There always, and there are many. Although certainly there are some that are so well known that they feel like they're the only ones. But we are certainly adhering to those that are the most well known as a best practice. For example, the OWASP application security. This is something that we're using, for example, the top 10 of OWASP and the principles that are defined into the OWASP. We're using it into the both into the design and into the testing and validation of the product. For example, those may be how exposed to injections what we do are, how broken authentication may happen or not. So we always try to test against those things to make sure that they cannot happen. The other access control failures, for example. And on top of that, we also use some certification framework, like for example, for the moment we're using the SOC 2, which is the very large certification model, but we're using it not only to certify formally, but to incorporate into the design again of what we're doing. And this includes, for example, things like logical access, monitoring, availability, auditing. This is another set of broader principles that we are using. And also when we implement the access control, we're using specifically the best practices and the guidelines from the NIST National Institute. There is a design guidelines for identity and access management that we are implementing in our products.
I guess it's the kind of thing that it's a constantly evolving threat. It's, security itself is something that we have to constantly kind of work on as well. So what do we do? Because there's those industry standards and the certifications that you talked about, but I guess in some ways we're looking to perhaps exceed what we can do. We're always trying to meet and evolve to what the latest sort of threats are.
Yeah, certainly that is top of the mind after the initial decision of that we want to do something. That becomes right away what we try to focus on, and right from the design. After on, when we start implementing, we have security tests which are implemented into the build pipeline of the products that we are building, which means when any new change is added, new function, new change, even new dependency is added into the code base, the automated pipeline is running through security scans, and if there is a failure, that blocks the deployment, even on the test environments, because we need to check that. So we have this automated leg that is very important, and especially for Avid Content Core, into the case that we're providing SaaS environment. This is indispensable. We also have, when we go closer to some completion of a given functionality, we have a penetration testing, which is more structured and target approach. There are numerous toolkits that we're using specifically for that, but what is it? We are actually trying to effectively break the system in every possible way, and we're using external contractors. Sometimes we're using part of it ourselves, because it's important also to try to get some distance from our own potential biases when we try to test that the system breaks, right? So this is important part. And again, the other thing is the threat modeling that I mentioned before that, because this is this is a very important part of what we're doing. It starts at design, but at the later stage of what we're doing, it also has a very important role, because this is defining the security button. We're running with it, like who is the adversary again, what they're trying to do, what is the blast radius if we decide that, for example, there is experiment, something goes wrong, what is the blast radius? This is part of the threat modeling that we're doing.
You mentioned, Avid Content Core there, and for anyone who's watching this later on, I'll bring up a QR code and you can find out more about Avid Content Core. But Avid Content Core, for people who don't know, is a content data platform. It's running on AWS, and it can be connected to on-premises Media Central systems. So Ilia, maybe talk a little bit about the measures that are taken with Avid Content Core and with that sort of connection to Media Central to ensure that whole work is done securely.
Oh yeah, that's very recent, obviously, of what we're doing with Avid Content Core. And first of all, because Avid Content Core is a SaaS product, which is a multi-tenant product, which means there is one general big environment in which all customers will have their tenant environment provisioned. So the first thing that we're doing is that we from the foundation, from the design, the tenant isolation is implemented into the Avid Content Core, which means every tenant, every customer, when that tenant is provisioned in Avid Content Core, there is design and implementation tools in place which ensure that all the data, the authentication, the metadata, the actual data, everything is separated and could not possibly reach out between different tenants. So this is the first thing. So there is not only physical to isolate the actual data and the configuration and everything else, but also to put in place some additional checks, which some of them comes from AWS. Right, we're using it as a platform. There is a already functionality, because we are obviously not the first one implementing this type of delivery, so we are actively using those tools, but also every key for encryption, everything is separate and is guarded separately for each tenant. So that is the first very important part. Then the other part is specifically for Avid Content Core. A big part of the workflow, the business workflow, involves that a tenant, a customer, will have to onboard their on-premises Media Central system, right? So they have to start using the assets and the media that are already there and be able to search them and so on. So this was specifically challenging, and I'm very happy with how we approach it, specifically because for many of our customers, the Media Central systems are really isolated on their premises. They are really closed up, and very often they just behind the VPN and nothing else, right? So having this connection to be first easy to set up for the customers, but also to be secure, that was very important. And what we do is that we really created this onboarding registration process for Media Central systems on ACC, on the Avid Content Core, which starts with establishing the trust between the two systems. It introduces all the needed cryptographic tools for the mutual authentication, which is the mutual TLS that we're using for everything from that point on. And this trust is, again, this is going to the zero trust that I mentioned, but it is aligned with that once it's established into the trust window, which is very well defined, from that point on, all the communication is always defined by the trust between the two systems. That is very well scoped. So this is the second important point. And this communication also that I mentioned between the on-premise system and the Avid Content Core, it's passing through the customer's infrastructure and so on. So it had to, we were forced to make several assumptions and to account from that, and to really brainstorm how different options could be put in place based on what we know for all of our customers' users of media Media Central. So it was one of the main functions that we added with Avid Content Core.
You mentioned something there, Ilia, that these things in some respects have to be simple. They have to be able for people to use, but there's a lot of complexity that sits behind what's actually going on. So we've talked there from a sort of technical perspective of how the system would be set up, but then the reality is we then have users who actually connect to the system itself. So how do we handle things like authentication or even logging or audit logging of what people are actually doing, because these are systems that are going to be used by hundreds or potentially thousands of different users?
This is obviously the central point. So the authentication is really a broad thing. The part of the authentication that immediately comes to mind when we're talking about this is the user authentication to the system, which means the actual user, the actual person that is going to fulfill the user use case needs to safely authenticate to the system. So this is the first part, and for this we using again the very proven functionality and tools from AWS. We're using their Cognito toolkit, which is the out-of-the-box the authentication and identity management tool, and we're implementing around this a way for every tenant to safely register their identity provider, their organization identity provider into their tenant environment, which means that if a customer, when they get their tenant environment in Avid Content Core, they could securely register their organization identity provider. So the same user, the same corporate user, exactly the same way they'll have SSO, single sign-on, when they're signing in to Avid Content Core. Right? This is important because without this, it could not scale. It could not be usable in any meaningful size of organization. So this is the first part. We're doing it, and what is very important for that is that our customers, we know from a previous experience with the other products that we developed already, that for the identity provider, they're taking care a lot of securing their environment. They are putting in place tools like multi-factor authentication, some other restrictions. They're grouping the users into different groups to be able to handle properly their access control based on the organization. So allowing this integration to be in place, we're really allowing all the work that have been done by the customers to really organize the access control in the organization to be brought into the ACC, into the Avid Content Core. And that's the major thing, again, for the user authentication. There is another side of this coin of the authentication, which is the machine-to-machine authentication, and it is not so visible for the users, obviously, but for the system implementation, it is paramount. It's very important. What it means that very often we have machines that have to talk to each other, right? And it is also not a trivial thing, and we have to allow the tenants also to manage this authentication very easily. This almost the same way that they manage the user authentication. For example, when the IT organization manages users into a given organization, they have one central place that they could decide this user is part of this group or this group. And it is similar for the machines. You have to decide this media center, for example, it will have to be registered, and then some exchange will going to happen between systems into your as a customer into your on-premise environment and ACC. So this is the other part, and we are also having for this very specific credentials and not passwords, but specific machine credentials that are easy and intuitive to configure for this type of configuration. So that is the second part, right?
And I guess following on from that, and maybe you're kind of alluding to it, is one of the things that we're implementing at Avid is an API first approach. It is about being open to integrations with not just other Avid products, but products from other people in the market as well. So I guess that's something else that you also have to factor in when it's coming to designing security around a system, is that ability to connect in potentially, the different devices and systems from even some of our competitors in some respects.
Yeah, certainly. In specifically in Avid Content Core, the API is really API first, right? It is not afterthought by any stretch of the word. All the functionality has their own API, and this is the design is starting with the API in mind, because API is really defining what is the function and not what is the implementation, which is very important. And it wasn't always the case historically, right? Historically, APIs grew, and there was this thing that they were very often exposing some internals and necessarily internal details in implementation. So we are very purposefully not doing that. We are really having the APIs which are tagged to the actual function, which is very important, and this is linked again to the authentication and authorization, because now when the API is linked to the function, it is very clear decision of what you authorize when you authenticate someone, right? When a user is trying to do some function, for example, delete an asset, right? It's not just some implementation detail, it is something that is really API representation of what you're seeing at the UI, right? So it is very connected and very intuitive also. Those decisions and the configuration of this is also very intuitive, because you don't have to deal with any unnecessary complexity about it, right? And also this means that all those different planes by which the integration could work and the use cases could be actioned on means that there is also always logging and auditing that is in place about these interactions, that putting in place how who accessed what, and if there is some high sensitivity action, for example, someone assigned a user for an admin role, this is always audited into the audit log, which is independent.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you've talked a little bit about, but I think it's important to highlight, is that security is a shared responsibility. It's not just something that is the responsibility of Avid or vendors. It's also a responsibility of customers as well. So there's a shared responsibility. So how do you deal with that kind of relationship? Where do the boundaries, if you like, lie between the responsibilities which we would have and the responsibilities which our customers have?
Yeah, this is a very important point, because as I mentioned, we are providing the SaaS platform, right? And yes, we are actually holding the SaaS platform, and we are provisioning the tenants for each customer that will have a tenant. And this is quite different from on-premises, when we were delivering the software and it is deployed on the customer's own infrastructure, right? This is obviously different. However, this doesn't mean necessarily that Avid handles every part of the security. Avid handles the much and important parts of the foundational security, but there are very important aspects that should be explicitly known for the tenants when they start using this. They have to know what they have to take into account when they configure, and we document this really to try to make this as easy as possible. For example, I mentioned the identity provider, right? This is the good thing, that you could, as a tenant, you could register your organization identity provider, which means that now you use your identity provider, but also means that you also have some responsibility as a customer, that you have to configure your identity provider properly, right? For example, multi-factor authentication, this is entirely configuration of the identity provider. So if a customer doesn't configure multi-factor authentication in their identity provider, they won't have multi-factor authentication in Avid Content Core as well, right? So this is an example of some responsibility, but there are more than that. For example, into the role-based access control into the Avid Content Core, there are roles, and those roles are also matched with some specific groups from identity provider. So this good implementation and rather good configuration of identity provider that you need to match clearly and be able to always see what is your configuration. That is important, because you're defining the roles of the users that are going to do something, and some of those roles obviously will be highly privileged roles. Some of those roles will be journalist editors, but some of those roles may be what we call tenant admins, which have the capability to change your identity provider settings. So yeah, it's something that should be known. There are other aspects of this, which is which when you think of it is maybe obvious, but when the customer owns the identity provider, it means the user lifecycle is now a responsibility of whoever owns the identity provider, because when you define or remove the user from the identity provider, that would obviously be reflected into the product access control, right? So this user would or would not be able to authenticate based on this action on the identity provider. For the service credentials as well, right? Some of those service credentials, although this is a lot more automated and it requires less management, let's say, but it also has a part, for example, when as a customer there needs to be authentication between on-premise systems and not. There is some decisions of how you configure your gateway, because this is how the connection is going to pass through. There is a proxy definition specifically for that. There are some expectations that we document as well. Also, the actual URL of the services that you're putting in place even could have some implications, because the trust, the actual implementation of this mutual trust is using the certificate similar but not the same to what you have when you're accessing a web page, when you have the TLS certificate and that the certificate is intact. It's just the two certificates that are always mutually trusted. And those are examples of what the customers have also very specific role in ensuring the end-to-end well-defined security of their content core is put in place, right?
Is it the case for that kind of thing, Ilia, that it's really an ongoing conversation with customers all the time about, here's the kind of measures that we're putting in place, here's the kind of things that they need to take into consideration? So is it the case that there's, if you like, there's advice going on both sides about, here's the best practices we're trying to implement, here's the responsibilities that you have, and just have that as an ongoing conversation?
Yeah, it's as I alluded to it just a moment before. There is some separation that the more explicit, the better, obviously, because it sets expectations very clearly, and it makes all the configuration, but also eliminates largely human error. So there is a boundary, and that boundary is that Avid owns the platform, everything that is underneath, which means all the tenant isolation, to make sure that all the data is going to be properly encrypted with isolated keys that are not mixing anywhere, that all the authenticated users are going to access what they're supposed to access, right? All the access control. This is all part of the platform which Avid implements and owns as a configuration, right? But then on the customer side, as I mentioned, obviously there is the identity provider configuration, right? There is this role assignment, there is the user lifecycle, and but also there is the actual credentials hygiene for the for example for the users, right? It's every organization makes a decision. For example, the obvious mundane example is some restriction of how complex your password could be, right? But it is something that is decided on the identity provider layer, so therefore it is entirely within the realm of responsibility of the customer's organization, right? And it's so this is quite well defined, and it's rather simple, I believe. It could become a little bit more nuanced, but it's still something that is well defined when we're talking about the different integrations, right? When a third-party system is going to be connected to Avid Content Core, right? Now you have both systems. You have Avid Content Core, which has a tenant, and the other side, it also has an owner, right? So you have to have some mutual understanding how to establish the trust. For the moment, all the systems which connect to Avid Content Core are, for example, the Media Central, which is owned by the same organization, right? This is something that we have the luxury for the moment to have given, but we know that this is not always going to be the case. So we're always putting in place the foundations for this to be clearly defined and quite manageable, so that there is no ambiguity in this responsibility for the secure configuration.
It's very clear from what Ilia says that security is everyone's responsibility these days, and adhering to best practices is a sound way of ensuring productions continue without any unexpected interruptions. So scan the code that's on the screen now if you want to download a security checklist with some key recommendations on how to maintain your defenses. Now scan the QR code on the screen now if you want to find out more about Avid Content Core, the AWS-hosted content data platform which Ilia spoke about. That's all for this episode of the show. Thanks to Ilia and to all our guests over the past few months. Thanks to Owen and Wim in the production team, but most of all, thanks to you for listening and for watching. So from me, it's goodbye.